Watercycle Octet is a piece of music I wrote as an A-level composition project when I was around 17 or 18 years old. The brief for the project was to write a piece of program music. I won't go into great depth about program music, but essentially in this context, program music is a piece of music that represents something beyond the music itself. For example, Strauss's Alpine Symphony is a musical description of a journey up and down an alpine mountain, whereas for example, a sonata by Mozart is absolute music, music that is to be enjoyed purely for the music itself, just as an abstract work of art. I'm quite proud of Watercycle Octet. I think it was a pretty good composition, it got a good mark. And there isn't actually that much that I would change, even nearly 10 years on, having studied composition at university for about 5 years. Um, but there are a couple of small things I'd change. The first of which is the instrumentation. Now, if we look over here, you'll see the instrumentation I've gone for is flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, violin, viola, cello. I decided this because I just assumed this was the standard octet arrangement. I didn't do any research into it at all, I just made an assumption. Which was perhaps a little bit foolish. Now, it turns out that there isn't really one standard combination of instruments that the word octet refers to in classical music, but there are some that are more common than others, and this is absolutely not one of those more common combinations. Does it matter? Well, maybe not. I still made use of all 8 instruments, and I think that the piece was quite effective. All of the instruments worked quite well, but in a practical sense, obviously it's a disadvantage to have a non-standard ensemble like this, because this ensemble just doesn't exist. So if I ever wanted to get this performed in a concert, yeah, I would struggle because this ensemble does not exist. There are no professional ensembles that call themselves octets that are this combination of instruments. Nevertheless, I don't think it is something that will ever get performed, unless, I don't know, someone discovers my music 1,000 years in the future and thinks that I was some kind of global superstar of my time. Anyway, moving on to the piece itself. Now, it's called Watercycle Octet, so unsurprisingly, the imagery that I'm attempting to evoke in this piece is imagery of the water cycle. The water cycle is obviously a cycle, so it doesn't really have a start and an end, but in geography class it tends to be taught as starting with the clouds and then ending back with the clouds. So I thought that would be an appropriate structure. It certainly seems to lend itself quite nicely to the musical structure of starting with something quite quiet and then floating back away into something quiet again towards the end. I chose F major for 2 reasons, really. Firstly, it's got a lot of pastoral connotations in classical music. Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, his Symphony No. 6, was written in F major. I don't quite know why. There are probably reasons for it, probably studies into it, but for whatever reason, F major is quite a pastoral sound. And also, the main theme from the movie Up, which was released a couple of years before I started writing this piece, that is in F major as well as in this thing. And so on. And that has obviously lots of associations with floating and clouds and things like that. So in my attempt to write something that sounds like clouds and floating, I chose F major. The time signature is 6/8. 6/8 provides a lot of flexibility. I like 6/8 because it's got 2 prime factors, 2 and 3. So you can divide the bar into 2 lots of 3 or 3 lots of 2, and you can do all sorts of fun rhythmic things with that. Brahms did that very well. Brahms is probably my favourite composer at the moment, and one of his best compositions, I think, his violin sonata in G major, first movement. That's in 6/4, and he plays around with the rhythm an awful lot. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. Let's go on to the first chord, which is this chord. C, F and A. This is an F major second inversion chord. The fact that we've got a C at the bottom means that it doesn't feel very grounded, doesn't feel rooted. It's not like if I'd done something like that, which feels much thicker, much more full. But I wanted to keep it light, airy, floaty, all the things that you associate with clouds. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might notice that the violin 2 is actually higher than violin 1. There is a reason for that. I will come back to that at the end. The second chord, and I promise I'm not going to analyse every single chord, but let's just have a look at this second chord. In hindsight, I think I could have spelt the A flat as a G sharp instead. I think a G sharp would have been better, but in terms of the sound, it's still the same note. So we've got that chord there, which is part of a whole tone scale. And whole tone scales are very commonly used to evoke dreaming and going off into the clouds, that kind of thing. And so having just a part of that feels quite cloudy, quite floaty, exactly the kind of vibe that I wanted to give in these opening few bars. I've also got a crescendo and decrescendo, so it's kind of going just kind of floating in and going away again, which is just kind of a bit of a breeze, perhaps, is what that's representing. Moving on to the clarinet melody, we come in with we've got a B natural in there, which makes it a kind of mixolydian mode feel for those jazz musicians among you. Again, this is quite floaty, quite airy. It doesn't really feel like it's grounded anywhere. It's just kind of floating somewhere. Also, the melody itself just floats up and down around that C. It doesn't jump anywhere. It's not, it doesn't really have much melodic movement in any direction. It's just floating around the C. The note C, not the actual water body C. We'll come back to that later. So this is all just designed to give the idea of floating. Another thing that that helps that is these little figures here, where the violin 1 and then later the violin 2, just here, and also the oboe have these ascending scales, these this kind of thing, just kind of floating off into the sky. Now, gradually, we introduce pizzicato in the strings. Now, the pizzicato in strings is very commonly used in classical music to represent raindrops, just light raindrops, not torrential rain. And this is exactly what I wanted to do here. The viola has stopped with its long accompanimental notes. It doesn't really need to hold this long C anymore because we've already got that in most of the clarinet melody. The clarinet melody stays more or less on that C anyway, so we don't really need it in the accompaniment as well. So instead, we've got this pizzicato figure, which I will just play. And so on. That starts to introduce the idea of drizzle, and gradually, as we move forwards, the other two high string instruments begin pizzicato as well, giving the idea of rain starting to gather force and more precipitation starting to fall. We also have the bassoon and then later the cello taking the melody in a lower octave. The clarinet was up here, now the bassoon is down here, and the cello as well. So this is gradually starting to fall, gradually starting to come towards the ground. Moving on to the next page, this bit of tune here, we have the clarinet taking the kind of main flowing tune, and so on. This tune is more or less directly lifted from Smetana's Vlatava, which is a piece of music that is meant to represent the river. I think the river, I should have researched this really. It's either called Vlatava or Di Moldau. Perhaps it's both of those, but in different languages. Anyway, it's a lovely piece of music that is representing a river, and the tune for it is something like. And my tune is. And so on. So the first few notes are pretty much identical. Uh, I've lifted that very literally. But hey, I didn't quite lift enough for it to be blatant stealing. I did change it just about in time. Elsewhere in the woodwind at this point, we have a lot of staccato material going on, lots of bouncy figures. I'll just play some of this. And so on. We've got a lot of counterpoint, there's a lot of different things going on, lots of kind of whirling. This sounds to me, in hindsight, like a stream with lots of bits of water kind of splashing everywhere. It's it's got a kind of main flow, but there's splashes all over the place, that kind of thing. I'll come back to that in a second. I'll just also like to point out this bar, which is entirely whole tone, and it resolves nicely back to F major without too much drama. So we get a bit more counterpoint, followed by the whole tone scale going back to F major quite calmly. And so on. And we're arrived back in F major. There's not too much of a fuss, it's not like rapids or anything like that, just a gentle stream. The section after this is all pizzicato in the strings. Here's how it goes. And so on. I think in my mind this was a continuation of the stream, and it was just lightly splashing around at the source of the river. There are a few different ways the water cycle can happen, including the water sinking into the ground and groundwater flow and all of that kind of thing. But the most exciting thing to represent is the surface flow, which is things like streams and rivers. That's much more musically appropriate. So yes, I thought at the time that this was a continuation of the stream idea. But in hindsight, it just sounds like more rain, which is obviously the wrong way round if I've already had a stream idea in the woodwind a few bars before. So this is another thing that I would change if I were writing this again. I would make it much clearer when we have the rain section and when we have the stream section, and try and make a bigger distinction between the two bits of musical material. We then move into G minor at the end of this pizzicato section at this cadence. And so on. This theme is the same as the clarinet theme we had earlier, but it's played on a violin playing arco for the first time in a while. Arco means bowed, rather than pizzicato, which means plucked. And this gives it a much fuller feel. We've got more going on in the woodwind, still quite light and sprinkly with all the staccato short notes, but then we also have these figures in the clarinet. Which is still quite light, but gradually introducing a bit of chromaticism, a few scales. The texture is slowly thickening up, and as the stream gets gradually wider and approaches eventually some rapids, it's all getting a little bit more sinister, and a few bars later we reach here. do apologise for the playback that Sibelius gives for these tremolos in the strings. They're meant to be kind of scrubbing effects with the bow, and yeah, it doesn't sound great on Sibelius. It sounds much better on the recording, which I will mention later. But we have all of these figures, which is these swirling chromatic scales as the water is forming these rapids. The stream is getting heavier. There's more going on. It's getting much more kind of aggressive, much more violent. The water. We then reach this section, which I like to call the Catch the Pigeon section, because I've got this very cheesy accompaniment figure going on in everything except for the flutes, which is... and so on. I can't actually remember where it's from, but there's some kind of cartoon that's got some song in it that goes catch the pigeon, or something like that. It's very silly. So I can't quite keep a straight face for this section, but it's meant to be this very angry waterfall section where the rapids are coming together. The stream is really ferocious now. The flute's playing this kind of cadenza bit over the top, and eventually we arrive after some very kind of angry, loud music, and the Catch the Pigeon motif kind of culminating in a big climax. Eventually we get to the waterfall, which you can almost see on the score. All of these notes just slowly cascading down and down and down and down. Now I want to point out the articulation in this section, which was very deliberately chosen. I started off with separate bows for all of the strings, and separate bows just makes it much more loud. The moment at which a bow turns from going one way to the other way has a kind of a slight scrubbing effect, so it's very, very loud and aggressive when you're playing that with full bows. Then, just here, this slur, this long line here, means that all of these are connected on the same bow, so they're much smoother. And then we get to here, where we have slower notes, and we have them staccato as well, so they're detached. There's a bit more space between them. So all of that creates this feeling that the intensity is going from, well, very intense on these very high notes just here, and gradually falling down and down and down and down. We also have a diminuendo written as a word, dim, and also as a symbol, these lines getting closer together. That means getting quieter, and that all contributes to this feeling of just falling down to the bottom and reaching something much more peaceful away from those rapids. I'll just play this segment. And we arrive in the next section. Sibelius doesn't do the diminuendo very well. It seems to stay very loud for most of that, but again, on the recording, that is fixed. We also have this flute moment, which uses part of the opening motif, the cloud motif, and acts as a kind of bird song, as if to signal we're in a much more tranquil, peaceful place now, a kind of still lake at the bottom of the waterfall, which does tend to be a feature at the bottom of a lot of waterfalls. I did do geography up to A level as well, so you'd hope that I know a little bit about the water cycle beyond just what it sounds like when it's written for 8 instrumentalists. So we arrive at this section. Now, you may have spotted we've had a key change. We've gone from F major to A major. Now, there's 2 reasons for this. Are there? No, the main reason is just because I wanted to have this as different from the cloud section at the beginning. I wanted to make sure this was very different because it would be easy to make them quite similar. They're both very kind of floaty, still, tranquil vibes. One's just in the sky, and one is on a still lake. So I wanted to make sure they were very different. And the way that I did this is by having this section in a different key, first of all, and also having everything much lower. Obviously, we've got lower instruments playing. The tune, when it eventually comes in, is on the bassoon and starts on that very low note. But the other reason I moved into A major is just for musical interest. If it stayed in F major for the entire piece, it would just be a little bit stale by the end. So I've got an opportunity to develop somewhere else by going into A major. This whole section is very still. There's no harmonic movement at all. You can see the viola and the cello just hold this chord for absolutely ages. It's an incredibly boring part to play, but a very essential part to get that still feeling. The bassoon comes in with a hint of the Mixolydian mode, again something that helps to get a kind of floaty feeling where there's no real sense of harmonic movement or melodic movement. There's no sense of direction, it's just staying there. So just for a little excerpt. And so on. These little bits of melody are just gently floating in and out and interacting with each other to keep a sense of interest whilst not really developing anywhere, because lakes don't really develop. Having said that, there is a bit of a kind of opening the curtains moment later on when we have a brief move to C major. I'll just play a bit of that. It's musically quite a nice arrival moment, without necessarily meaning too much in the way of what it's trying to represent. But it quickly fades back down again with these diminuendos and just goes to something very quiet and still. We then have the next section. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Smetana's Vlatava is a strong influence for this piece. It's one of my all-time favourite pieces of music, and it has got a section where the river that it's trying to represent is flowing through a small town, and there's a festival going on by the river in this small town. So there's a lot of bustling, a lot of movement, and a lot of activity, and that's exactly what I wanted to do in this section. So the second violin picks up the main tune, taking its mute off. That's Senza Sword. It came on a little bit earlier just here because a mute just makes everything a bit softer, which is exactly the kind of vibe I wanted for the lake. Anyway, we take the mute off at this point, and the second violin has a little solo. I'll just play a quick excerpt from here. And so on. So we've got all of these melodies in the woodwinds, especially, that are kind of interjecting and kind of playing with the main melody that the second violin has. That's the kind of core to this section. I was very, very proud of this section at the time. It was easily my favourite bit of the piece at the time, and I don't know, I like all of the piece now, to be honest. But it's still up there. And one of the things I was most proud of was this descending bass line. in the violas and cellos. It's very subtle because it's only one pizzicato note at the start of, well, one bar in every two, starting on a G sharp, going down to a G, F sharp, F, E, D sharp, and I managed to fit all of the harmonies above that with that bass line. I think chromatic descending bass lines are one of the most satisfying things you can get in music. Gradually, forces join together, and instead of just having little bits of melody interjecting, we arrive at something where everything's joining forces on this C sharp pedal moment. Admittedly, we do still have bits of melody being passed around between the instruments, but there's much more of a sense of collective force going on. What I mean by a C sharp pedal is just this here. We've got the cello holding a C sharp for a very long time, and this creates a sense of tension. The C sharp wants to resolve somewhere. Usually, it wants to resolve up a fourth or down a fifth. That's what a dominant pedal in classical music theory is. Well, all music theory, not just classical. But at this moment, what I do is I have a double opening the curtains moment just here. First of all, this C sharp turns into a C natural as we have a little key change back into F major, our home key. And then that C natural has its resolution moment going back to F major at the end there. So I'll just play you that kind of double opening the curtains moment, letting the sunlight in, and I'll tell you what that represents once I've played it. And so on. Yeah, that sounds a lot better on the real live recording. So hopefully you do listen to that once you've finished this video. Now obviously, well, perhaps not obviously, this double opening the curtains moment is when the river arrives at the mouth and goes into the vast, expansive ocean, the sea at the end. So we've been through the city, and this is, I often imagine one of those helicopter camera views in nature documentaries where you're kind of rushing along this busy river. Maybe it's not a helicopter, maybe it's a drone or something, and there's trees rushing past either side of the camera, and then suddenly you just kind of rise up above the line of the trees, and suddenly you can see the whole river that you've just been, rushing along, and you can see the sea that the river is flowing out into, and it's just this kind of vast, beautiful panoramic view that you get from the helicopter camera sweep or drone camera sweep, whatever it happens to be. So that's what I often imagine at this moment, this kind of arrival moment back into F major and back into all three actually of our main themes. We've got the flute and oboe playing the kind of the theme that was initially raindrops in the viola pizzicato. And so on. We've got the clarinet and bassoon playing the theme that I pretty much stole from Smetana's Vlatava. And we've also got the cloud theme going on in the strings. So all of the different elements of the water cycle are coming together, and it's all just pooling in the vast, expansive ocean. Now, combining lots of different melodies from earlier on in the piece is something that Gilbert and Sullivan do very well and very commonly. I would love to say that that was an influence, because Gilbert and Sullivan was a huge part of my university life, but the key word in that is university life. That's 2 words. You know what I mean. I hadn't yet experienced much in the way of Gilbert and Sullivan by that point in my life. So I can't really claim that that was an influence, but just generally the idea of bringing main themes from the piece back all together at once is something that has been done in all sorts of contexts, and I thought this was a nice way to do it, especially as the ocean is, all the water um, combining into one huge expanse. Maybe it's inappropriate to have the cloud theme in there because oceans are not clouds, but the fact that it's played loudly, forte here, means that it does have a very different feel to when it was just played as the cloud theme. The poor cellos and violas, after all of their boring parts earlier on in the piece, just have accompaniment again here. They just have a nice spread arpeggio type thing going on. Just to support everything else that's going on. So this goes on for 16 bars just to be a nice tune. It's not really going anywhere, it's just a really nice kind of forte tune to represent the climax of the piece, the moment of arrival into the ocean, with the water droplet that we've been following all along as it meets all its friends in the ocean, or something like that. Make of it what you will. From this point onwards, we do reach a very high note, as you just heard, and it's gradually floating away. We reach F major and we stay on F major all the way through to the more or less the end. We've basically arrived home now, and this moment in the piece is when the water starts to evaporate back off. So we're quieter now. Obviously we've got lots of high notes, floating upwards, lots of associations with the idea of evaporation. So I'll just play you a little bit of this, and you can just hear one by one each instrument floating away. The first one to float away is the violin 2, which just comes to rest. The flute comes to rest. The clarinet comes to rest. The oboe comes to rest. The strings have come to rest. Whoops. And finally, the violin 1 arrives on its own on that F. That's back to the opening, back to the original cloud motif, and in fact, the very opening chord, exactly as it was presented in the opening. Now, I said earlier that there was a reason why the second violin played a higher note than the first violin in the opening chord. This is it. The first violin is the last one to evaporate in this section, and it ends on that F. It comes to rest on that F, and I wanted it to stay there, and then the other instruments to come in around it. So the second violin took that A above the F, and the viola the C below the F. And then we carry on towards the end. Now, there is one last thing that I would probably change about this piece if I were to write it again today, and that is that I would probably put the violin 1 as the more prominent of the two violin parts as often as I can. It's very rare in this kind of music that the violin 2 has more to do than violin 1, or has higher notes, things like that. The violin 1 always takes the more kind of prominent role. So, for example, earlier on in that kind of bustling town section, the violin 2 had the entire melody, and the violin 1 was hardly doing anything. My justification for that was because the violin 1 was the last one to finish the previous bit on this very high note, and because both violins had to remove the mute from their strings, I wanted to make sure the violin 1 wasn't in a rush to remove the mute before going into the next section. If I gave all of this to violin 1, there would have been a panicked moment with the violin 1 having to remove the mute, whereas because of these rests here for the violin 2, there is a good amount of time for the violin 2 to get ready to play that. So there is a justification behind it, and I don't think it's a crime by any means, but it is much more standard to give the violin 1 all of the prominent stuff, and that's there are good reasons to stick with what's standard. But I won't go too deeply into that now. I don't think it's a major error or anything like that. Just something I'd probably look to change if I wrote it again. So we get back to the initial cloud chords with the F major in its second inversion, and this kind of whole tony type chord there. The clarinet comes back with the cloud motif that we had at the beginning. But this time, instead of developing further and going into G minor or something like that, we just stay in F major and just oscillate between F major and the kind of whole tone chord, the augmented chord. Obviously, I need to find a way to end the piece. The water cycle never ends, but this has to, so I just ended on a nice F major chord and finally gave this second inversion chord its tonic, so that it finishes in root position, which makes it feel a little bit more grounded. Still not as grounded as if I did something like some kind of triumphant ending like that, but it has the feeling of a finish at least. And the clarinet just floats beautifully onto this F. Not too high, not too low, just floating perfectly in the middle on that kind of mid-range F for the clarinet. I will leave a link to the recording that was made in the description. It's on my YouTube channel. I think it's one of my most viewed videos, so it's probably not too difficult to find. I highly recommend listening to that recording. The bits that I've played you on Sibelius here do not do it justice. I think it's worth giving it a listen, if only for the very last note. It was recorded by a group of other students. I think we did actually hire 2 professionals to help out as well in a kind of recording session for all of the GCSE and A-level compositions for that year. Anyway, I had, I think, half an hour or an hour to do a quick rehearsal. Well, the teacher led the rehearsal. I just kind of stood there in the room and interjected occasionally. And when we got to the final recording, we were running out of time, so we got to the stage where, however the last take went, that would have to be it. We did do a couple of takes of the first half, but the second half, I think we just had to go through once and just hope it was okay. So we got to these very last notes. I won't shout out everyone in the octet, but they were all brilliant. They all played really, really well. But the clarinetist was a friend of mine called Tristan. And he played these last notes. He got to this F, and he kind of came in kind of medium volume and started fading away. And I could immediately tell that he was going to put a kind of shape on the note. That's fairly common when you're playing a very soft note like this, where you kind of lean into it at the start and then fade away, and then gradually it grows back until it fades away again. So, you know, if you're doing it as a chart, it would start medium loud, go down to almost nothing, then come back to quiet, relatively quiet still, and then just fade to nothing again, and actually finish that time. It was a really lovely way to shape the note. But the thing is, when he started the initial kind of descent from medium loud to very quiet on that kind of first dip in the volume of the note. He went so quiet that I thought he was going to lose connection with the flow of air in the clarinet altogether, which would mean a kind of hiccup coming back into the note. I thought instead of the intended shape, which was something like it would end up being something like with a little hiccup to come back in. And I could honestly feel my heart skip a beat because it would have been such a shame to have such a lovely ending ruined by this kind of hiccup moment. But he didn't. He didn't lose connection with the airflow. It went to basically inaudible, but there was still something there. There was still a tiny sound there, and he just grew back out of it into still a relatively quiet note. It was beautiful shaping. Um, so if you're interested in that kind of stuff, then get some really good headphones on. Listen to the last few minutes. Well, the last few seconds really of the live recording of Water Cycle Octet, and really enjoy that beautiful F that Tristan played on the clarinet to wrap up the piece. And on that note, I will also wrap up. Literally note. Oh, brilliant joke. Thank you very much for listening to this score analysis of Water Cycle Octet. I do hope to do score analyses of other pieces, maybe not necessarily my own, in the future. Let me know what you think. Like, comment, subscribe, all of the usual stuff. Thank you very much, and have a lovely day.